Hello, welcome to Why Aren't You Reading? This week we are reviewing Batman, The Golden Age, Volume 1. I'm John, co-owner of Brainstorm Comics and Gaming.
Chandler.
And so, I guess my first question to you is, there were a lot of stories packed into this volume. I think there was 20-some altogether. How do you feel the character has grown and evolved from these?
Well, I feel definitely, and I already knew this, that Detective Comics, as we know it now, is just another Batman title. But back then, he premiered, which a lot of people know, in Detective Comics 27. But Detective Comics was a thing that was already ongoing, and he wasn't the only story that was happening in that book. There were other things, and he was initially it's like, oh, well, we have a lot of just street level detectives type of thing. It would be kind of cool for this idea of a superhero type-esque thing, or more of a vigilante kind of The Shadow or something, where I'm just wearing a mask and a costume. I'm still a detective, but there's an added element of that I'm not just an everyman wearing a suit and a fedora like every other magazine that's going on. So it was something to separate and make it a bit different, and it grew in popularity, but until then it was still just mixed in with other stories.
It was
one of several stories in Detective Comics.
It was 8 to 10 pages.
Yeah, for the first several times, kind of until Robin was introduced, a year or so later, and then he started getting his own specials and annuals that were 64 pages of just Batman.
Second series.
Because it became so popular, and then it also became a newspaper series and stuff it grew in popularity. But initially it was just a guy that was mixed in with other detectives. So in terms of origin story, he didn't really get one until it became apparent that, oh, people like this guy, so we should delve more into it. So initially in the very first story, which I don't it's very famous now and DC has reprinted it and stuff, so I've read it before, but it's just his name is the same, he's a billionaire, Commissioner Gordon's there. Other than that, there's not a whole lot. He's just a guy, puts on a bat suit, fights crime, stops it, and detects, solves mysteries and fights crime in a suit. But in terms of the whole Batcave and everything we're accustomed to and we know doesn't exist yet, because it was just a guy with a little idea they had and they wanted to add into the other detectives going on.
But you see some elements of the things that grow into those things. For instance, he's driving around in a car that's nowhere near as cool as the Batmobile, but you would think that people would think, what that guy's just driving by in a normal
mask and a cape and pointed ears. But
you also see him using grappling hooks even in the first one. They're not attached to the Batarang or anything like that.
Right.
But
although it does appear pretty early on. Yeah. There are certain things that do appear a lot quicker than I would have been led to believe, that I thought came much later or everything.
The Batcopter appears pretty early.
Even he gets a car eventually that it's not the Batmobile yet, but it is the same color as his outfit, and it's very similar in shape to kind of, you can see where eventually, okay, they added a bit more onto it and made it that. But he develops sleeping pellets in his utility belt pretty early on, and then the Batarang comes in, I think fifth or sixth issues to getting started. So there are certain things, and his origin story, as I said, that they decided they need to create because he became popular, very similar to what we come to know, to even what Frank Miller wrote about. It's almost the exact same thing. It's walking down the alley, parents murdered, oh no, I'm gonna avenge them and take my war on crime. And it even talks about him, as he grew older, becoming, as smart as he can in detective stuff, as strong as he physically can to prime his body. And then it even more surprisingly had that famous, scene of him in his study, I need to be a symbol, what can I do? Bat breaks through the window, and yes, that's a sign, I'm gonna become a bat, which I was very surprised to see. I thought that would have been years after the character, but that they threw that in the beginning of an issue, I think 6 or 7 issues in. So for origin story, it's pretty early on, from 1940 to now. That's pretty much the same thing. So there's definitely elements that are very different from how he is now, and things that are missing that obviously get added on when you have a character for 70 years. But some things, surprisingly, that have been there pretty early on and have stayed for the whole length of the character.
Now, one of the things that might surprise people who don't know is, at the beginning, Batman actually did kill
Yes,
his opponents.
He's not anti-gun and he's not anti-murder. He wasn't going around killing every single person, but not Punisher style. But it was more of, I don't care because they're bad guys.
If it happens, it happens.
Yes, he doesn't have his strict moral code that he would eventually become so famous for and is known for in the comics. That doesn't exist yet. So there are scenes where he's holding a gun. There are scenes where, and I will say he doesn't shoot people very often, but there's scenes where he holds it, and there are definitely scenes where he, like kicks people into vats, knocks people off buildings, like people get murdered in fights or stuff happens, and other stuff where it's not, he doesn't necessarily do the murdering, but it happens, and he's kind of like, good. Like, if you were to go back out into the public, like, who knows what would have happened. Like, I didn't do it, but I'm not mad about this. Whereas the Batman we know now would be very upset about this and does not like anybody to be murdered.
No, I think you and I have discussed this before, though. It's actually a component of the character, I think, changed in the wrong direction. Not necessarily because I am for murder, but because I think for the character it would fit more if he did kill some of his villains. Like, he knows the Joker's not going to get any better. He knows the Joker's going to go out and kill...
Maybe. We read White Knight, so who knows?
So, well, that's an alternate world, but he knows the Joker's going to kill other people and put kids in the same position that he's in and that he doesn't have his parents. I think Batman, as a pragmatic character, would do those things. I think that would strengthen the difference between Superman and Batman. And Superman's my favorite character. Like I said, I'm not saying Batman should kill because, like, I'm for indiscriminate killing or anything like that. Punisher's not a favorite character of mine.
Feels like it. Can't do it, man.
But, I mean, I think you understand what I'm saying. Though,
I do. I think it ties into to the childhood trauma, though, of witnessing a murder right in your face that he... And maybe, and I know they've talked about that in the comics, too, but I think that's more they let... It's not necessarily the tough guy thing to have, but it would make sense to where if you, as a small child, witness a murder right in your face, to you yourself not be able to get to that point of, like, stopping yourself, which he says for moral code and justice, but it might be simply the fact that, like, I can't take a life because I was so traumatized as a child by witnessing it that I can't bring myself to do that type of deal, even though you want him to so badly.
Well, like I said, for me, like, it's just because the Joker, is going to go out and kill more people. But
maybe not. There's always hope.
Well, my other thing is, without ever having killed a person, then the villains wouldn't take his threats as seriously, like when he has them hanging from, like, a building or whatever. But,
I don't know. They seem to be pretty scared of him.
So, but I mean, you know what I'm saying. So, what was your favorite story out of the ones that we had read?
I kind of like that you see throughout this collection, which is Detective Comics 27 through 45, and then there's 3.
Batman 1 through 3.
And then
The World's Fair.
The World's Fair, which is a tie-in book with Superman, which was with Jerry Siegel and whatever the other guy's name is. Not important. They're dead. So I think Joe Shuster. My favorite, probably, you see like guys like Hugo Strange and the Cat, which would become Catwoman, and Joker, and a couple of people like that who maybe necessarily weren't intended to, but as we know are still around.
Became iconic.
75, 80 years later, they're still here.
Oh, the Joker's way different than what we... he's mostly just dressed up as a clown.
A little not. Like, he's still... Like, I kind of wanted to talk about that story because I was surprised that his first thing that he did was he did kill people and they died with that big grin on their face, which I was surprised. I thought, again, that would have come more like much, much later, because I was always under the impression that, like, oh, well, which, again, like everything back then, until you knew it was going to be successful, everything was just a throwaway character. So initially, he was a throwaway character, but they thought it was pretty cool. They had him twice in he first appeared in the Batman, the first Batman, and but he did, like, right away. Like, that was his motif, was he killed people from poison and they died with the big grin on their face. Now, he was definitely a little more, like, monotone, less, like, maniacal laughing, although he did laugh, and it did even towards
he didn't seem to tell as many jokes
his second. No, not as many. Like it was definitely more of just like, look how, like, scary I look, and I'm going to, like, kill you, and be more of, like, focused on crime type of deal. Whereas more of, like, I'm more like Joker, like I'm funny, like, look at me, like, failed comedian type thing. Like, that came more into more like 50s, 60s, and definitely as like the TV show came out, that became definitely more of his arsenal. But the look is still very similar right from the get-go, and then the motive of killing was the same. So I was surprised by that.
And you can see him being the bridge now through having read the story from the gangsters to the more colorful. Because at first he's like that kind of like in between. He's not quite the colorful character.
Right.
He is a colorful character. But
right, but back then that type of character didn't necessarily even exist. It was all if you committed a crime, you were a gangster, or you were like the only other thing they had was like evil scientist type deal of like who was like smart enough that they had like world taking over plans or type of deal. But usually they still, even like as you see with Hugo Strange, tied in back to like, well, I am an evil world, taking over mad scientist, but I still love crime, so I'm employing these gangsters, and we're going to do like low-level street crimes because it's a detective comics, and it's what it is. It wasn't action comics, it wasn't Superman, couldn't really deal with aliens type of deal because he was a detective. So I think for the longest time, it had to be more serious, street level. Even with a character like a Joker, he was treated very seriously, and he was murdering people. I think in his first appearance he kills like 4 or 5 people right away. Like he was a very like serious threat. It wasn't ridiculous costume like, oh, I'm a crazy person, like look at me, like look at what a wacky character I am. It was still like, this is serious, like he just happens to look like a clown.
And one of the things I will say to the people who are looking to read it is it definitely is told in like that late 30s, early 40s style where it's a little hokey in some parts, and
for sure. And there's some
don't look too closely at some things.
There's some language that is not cursing, but just like words and phrases that don't get used anymore, and turn of phrase type of things that Batman and the other characters will say of just expressions that were common in 39 and 40 that we don't really say anymore. And
I think the detective stories were very like simple, like to the degree.
Yes, they were 10 pages, straightforward. Like, how am I gonna? Yeah. So you have to keep in mind that the book was written, in 1939, 1940. So it's a very long time ago. It's old. Which you'll notice from both the terminology used, the slang, and also the art is very much where, like I was telling you, the covers are all very cool, they're very well done, and that was how the business went. Comics was still fairly new business, so it was very much like, look at this really cool cover, everything is really awesome, you want to grab that, give us your dime, and then everything in the interior was less focused on. So
well, the thing is, even though I just said it's hokey, I mean for this time period, it was definitely not hokey. It was a
darker, really cool. It was a serious thing, like we said. Like there's a lot of grim stuff. There's a lot of murder. Like it was a serious. It wasn't necessarily. You have to put it in the time frame that it was. It wasn't for kids. Like so much so that they were like, hey, we should maybe give him a sidekick because
lighten him up a little bit.
Yeah, this is like he's popular, but this is starting to be a little gruesome, and parents might not be happy if it's just a masked guy just constantly going around, and all these villains are just murdering people all the time. So Robin was added in fairly quick. I think like the 12th or 11th issue he was added in
pretty early,
and his origin story again surprisingly was the exact same, of even down to the name of Haley Circus and Boz Zuko, and like all that stuff, like verbatim, was like exactly the same story. So although
I will admit to have not known that it was based on Robin Hood and not like the bird. I thought they were just going for like a...
Yeah, I think that became a little... Somebody realized, oh, well, he was an acrobat and they kind of fly, so that came more of a thing. But I think with, I'm not surprised with the green and the...
I'm not surprised,
definitely the costume always seemed to me a little inspired.
I was unaware of that. I don't know whether you were or not, but...
I think I always thought it was a bit of both, but it definitely seems more like it was just the Robin Hood motif, and Batman just happened to be there and show up right at the exact second and say, hey, you're my kid now. Let's fight crime.
And that's another story where...
They swore that oath by candlelight.
And it's another story where Batman throws somebody off of a building.
Hey, they needed to be thrown off a building, man. Don't question it. It's what needed to happen.
So I was going to say earlier, and the stories are definitely very simple. They're not even as complex as like a Hardy Boys or a...
No, and like we said, they were like one of maybe 4 stories in the book. So they had like 10 pages, and it was very much like Although they did fairly early on start having a bit of like cliffhangers and part twos and like not as much to one specific issue as I would have assumed.
I think they realized that Batman was their cash cow, so
right,
it was like,
and it became
come
popular.
back
Yes,
next.
so it's very much like, oh, well, how's he gonna get out of this? Or like, oh, you enjoyed this story. Well, wait till we have for you next month.
And
like,
the first one that did that actually had some components that I didn't think would be introduced that early. The vampire story that you and I were talking about before the video started. I was kind of like a little shocked that was in there because I've told you before I've always envisioned Batman as strictly a street level character. I don't like seeing him in outer space. I don't like seeing him in alternate.
That's why we have Green Arrow.
So he encounters a vampire, and we're also introduced to that he has a fiance, which again I did not know he had a fiance.
Julie, no last name.
Yes.
Yes.
Um,
Lovely Julie.
And she didn't really get fleshed out that much, at least not.
Well, she was a woman. It was 1940, and they couldn't be bothered. Plus, also they had 10 pages, and the vampires were more pressing than the fiance.
Yes.
I think that was more to just add to the whole thing of like, look, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist, super bored, hates his life. It's all up front. He even has a fiance, but he doesn't really care because his real identity is Batman, and he hates evil, and he must fight it for the sake of justice. So it was more of just, I think, in terms of fleshing out a character, she didn't get fleshed out because it was just like, oh yeah, can't be Bruce Wayne. Look at him. He's got a fiance now. Like,
Yeah.
he could never be the Batman. So much so that she doesn't even think about it.
And I think the vampire story was what, 3 parts?
2 parts.
2 parts. Okay.
Written by Bill Finger and Gardner Fox, who are both, Bob Kane and Bill Finger obviously created Batman. Gardner Fox came in, and he's a very...
I know you have strong feelings about that.
If you know anything about DC Comics, Gardner Fox and Bill Finger both, Bill Finger wrote until like his death for DC Comics in like 1974, and Gardner Fox is a very much for Golden Age and then Silver Age, very, created a lot of characters, wrote for a lot of characters for decades. So it's cool to see kind of their beginning, their start to that type of deal. But yeah, Bill Finger definitely.
I know you have strong feelings.
Well, he was forgotten. He was, Steve Ditko to Spider-Man for a long time. He was not a name that people knew because even if you read the things, Bob Kane says Batman by Bob Kane written on there. He does not get credit for everything. So Bill Finger never really got his due for a very long time. He wasn't even, now it says Batman created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, but until honestly very recently, a couple years ago, his name was not included in any way, even though so Bob Kane created the storyline that he created everything, and that Batman was his creation, and if it was up to him, you wouldn't even know who Bill Finger was. However, Bob Kane kind of had like an idea of like, hey, I want a detective, but I want him to kind of be like a vigilante, and here's an idea I have, and he drew something, and it wasn't even quite what Batman was in the first one, and Bill Finger saw it and goes, okay, that's pretty neat, but I have some changes, made him more, slimmed down, not like crazy wings, made it more of a cape type thing, more of an actual suit and type of, and the rope and swinging through the city, and more of the Batman that we know now. Bill Finger reined that in, and also he was the one who wrote all the stories for forever. Bob Kane just did the art with the help of some other people. Bill Finger wrote most of the stories. As I said, Gardner Fox wrote a couple, but Bill Finger wrote for years and years, wrote on Batman, and never really got credit for it. It was always just Batman by Bob Kane. So you have really Bill Finger to thank for any Batman fans out there. Although Bob Kane's is the first name that comes out, it was definitely not so much a collaborative effort. It was very much Bill Finger's creation, and unfortunately did not get to see recognition for that before he passed, but his family's still alive. There's actually a really cool documentary on Hulu where the family does get brought in, and he now, every time you mention it or say created by, you have to put Bill Finger's name up there. So didn't get to see it in his lifetime, but it is good that he finally gets the recognition for creating a character that I love and millions of people love all over the world. So really cool guy, and as we said in here, the writing is definitely very much 1939, 1940 style, where they had a very limited time to tell a story, so it's quick. A lot of there's not necessarily so much narration. It's a lot of and then and so and drawing too, but it's a lot of the dialogue is very much like over explaining what's happening, but that was very on par for what was going on at the time.
Yeah.
They were not the only comic to do that. They were all doing that. So you can read a little bit and go, that seems a little redundant, but it's still good. It's fun. It makes it, it brings a little smile to your face. It's nice to kind of like,
it's not agonizing.
Look back. No, it's not painful reading. It's just it's fun to kind of look back on yesteryear and be like, wow, this is what comics were like back then.
And it's cool to see like the threads, like I was talking about, to see how it grew into what we see today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like I said, like the Batcopter that we talked about had a hanger, which like I'm saying like that to me kind of developed into like the Batcave.
Sure, and then we said the car kind of developed into that. The Batarang came on fairly early on. His costume even goes through a tiny bit of changes, just even in these, first, collection that we have here. So it is cool to see that even, as early as, I think this one stops even before 1941. So it's definitely the very beginning. But
I wanted two more things before we go into our closing thoughts. So the first one was, how would you compare? We did Ant-Man, the Epic series, a couple weeks ago. We reviewed that. How would you compare like the two? And I know it's a little unfair because that one was done like 25 years after this one.
I would say in terms of villain, they immediately from the gate, I think just because it was the 60s and people were more accustomed to that, they right from the get-go were a little bit more of like allowing type of more of supervillains that we'd be more aware of today, of kind of like crazy zany ideas. Ant-Man focused a little bit more on science than more of like detective work and street level. But I will say for the longest time I always thought Golden Age and Silver Age, like that's not really a big difference. They're both really old, like who could say? But even from 1940 to 1963, 64, when that was written, you can see a difference. Even just in style of writing, even style of artwork, where it became more important for every panel to try to be more well done, and
not as much exposition. Still some exposition.
Yes, but definitely more of like each issue is going to be a creative effort, and we want to put our best work in. Not so much of just like, all right, like I gotta draw a lot of these. That's one guy doing like several different books for 1 month. So there are definitely some similarities where it's still it's older, and there's definitely still some of the same type of campy, not at the time, but when you look back on it, it feels it's definitely older, but definitely differences, and you can definitely see. I think it's a good way of seeing the difference between kind of Golden Age and moving into the Silver Age of even though 60s are a long time ago, you can see that it is closer to now than 1940 was.
Well, I think it depends on some of it, because after the Comics Code came in, a lot of the writing regressed a little bit because they were trying to make sure they stayed within the guidelines that were imposed on them. It wasn't their fault. It was more
safe and appropriate for the people.
Yeah. And then the other one I wanted to ask you is like, what did you think was, I won't say funniest, but the most like out of character sort of thing for?
Well, I mean, as we talked about, he definitely didn't have his moral code. So there was, I think there was one, like I said, where he didn't kill somebody, but he was fighting somebody and he threw them. And at one point during the fight, the guy had a sword, and it got like put through a door, and he threw the guy, and he fell on the sword, and it killed him. And he was like, "Oh, that was not my intentions." He's like, "But it's better that he be dead, because out on the streets he could have killed, so many more. So I'm grateful for him." But kind of the whole, just the blurb of the explanation is very much, they're like trying to be like, he's not a murderer, but listen to what he has to say. He kind of has a point, type of deal. But it's also a very much, the bad guy was also like a mustachioed, like with a goatee, like a type of, I think he was French or something, like type of very much like stereotypical caricature.
Well, the one gangster in there kept saying "C" at the end of every sentence.
Because that's how gangsters talk in 1940. You didn't know that?
It's a very common trope. The funniest thing to me was the opening scene where like the crime got called in. Commissioner Gordon sitting with him. He goes, "Hey, can I go to the crime scene with you?" "Sure, why not?"
1939, there were no rules. You do whatever you wanted.
You're a billionaire.
You're fine. We're friends. Okay, you can come. Don't worry about murder. It's fine.
So who would you recommend this to? Like, what would you...
I would definitely say anybody who is a DC Comics fan, anybody who's a Batman fan, that's interested, knows the origin story, but doesn't necessarily know everything about the character. It's fun. Anybody who's interested in older comics or just taking
An affordable
history.
way to I know you didn't have to borrow the graphic novel because you have all the issues at your house.
Oh yeah, totally. I'm a self-made millionaire with just all these issues. But it is cool that DC has, made, I think there's like 6 or 7 volumes now of the Golden Age from his first appearance.
And they do them in order.
Yes,
so.
Which is very cool that it's not skipped around. They haven't lost them to, the perils of time and just, losing print of everything. They've done a good job of keeping everything and collecting everything. And you really can, if you really want to read every Batman story, this sets you up to have a good case of collecting if you want to, and or just reading every Batman story. And like you get to see that development even from the very first collection of, okay, like that's still here now, or like this came, or that's not, but I can see where it changed.
This is kind of like a prototype for it. Yes.
Yeah. So it's a very cool look into anybody who's remotely interested in the character, but also people who just love comics and are interested in seeing kind of, this was how superhero comics started, was this type of thing, like between this and then Superman and Action Comics, this is how it came to be. So it's a cool look back into that.
I think it's a good book I know we talked about Batman murdering in it, but it's not graphic. I think this is a good book for like even younger readers. I wouldn't say like under 12 or so.
It's not
but
super dark. It mentions it, but there's no blood or anything. They couldn't show things like that.
I mean, because a lot of parents right now, like the newer stuff sometimes does get a little bit more graphic and more
dark and violent. There's some language.
And like I said, this lays the groundwork for the character that you know already. And obviously kids won't find it as hokey as an adult would. So
Sure.
I definitely think like whether you're a new reader or an older reader, I mean, if you're an older reader and you want to delve deeper into the history of the character and see like how he's grown, like you were saying, developed over the years. Like I said, a lot of the stuff that are prototypes in the first couple of issues that you can see the strings, like how it'll grow into like the things that we know. Right now, I'm very interested in like the history of comics. I'm going deeper and deeper into that right now. I told you about a couple of books I've been reading and stuff like that. But if you're into the history of comics, I would definitely say you want to read this one also. It's, like I said, it's really well done. It doesn't feel as dated as it could. Like I said, some of it in terms of the language used, yes, but in terms of story, not so much. But hopefully you enjoyed this episode of Why Aren't You Reading, and see you next time. Hello, welcome to Why Aren't You Reading? This week we are reviewing Batman the Golden Age. I'm John, co-owner of Brainstorm.
What are you doing?
What are you doing?
You never said the second part.
I do!
You never said that in your entire life.
Alright, we're going to start back.